From racingnews365.com. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of our podcast, looking ahead to this weekend's Dutch Grand Prix, which marks the conclusion of the F1 summer break. From racingnews365.com, my name is Nick Golding and I'm joined solely by Young Journalist of the Year from 2023. It is, of course, Sam Coop. Lead editor Ian Parks is not joining us for this week's episode because he is enjoying a well-deserved rest on holiday. Sam, where has the time gone? Somehow, the F1 summer break is done and dusted. It's race week.
I know, it flies by, doesn't it? I mean, I think partly because, as we know, the summer break is actually only 2 weeks where you're not allowed to kind of be in the factory, be in the office for these teams. So that first week, if you remember, there was loads of news. There was the Perez stuff. There was obviously Sainz to Williams, Jonathan Wheatley to Audi. So that, I think, kept us pretty busy in that first week. And then, yeah, we're already right at the end of it. So, yeah, it has flown by.
10 races to go, starting off with the Dutch Grand Prix this weekend. Of course, the home race for Max Verstappen, so it makes sense to start with him. He enters this weekend, obviously, with a 78-point lead in the Drivers' Championship. And weirdly, there's been a lot of speculation, hype over a potential fight between himself and Lando Norris for the Drivers' title, despite the large margin between them, which I think is really interesting, given something we actually recently discussed on last week's podcast, that actually, the biggest margin that's ever been overcome was by Sebastian Vettel in 2012. He was 39 points behind Fernando Alonso with 7 races to go. Lando's got to do double that. Yeah, actually, there's almost more hype and speculation that he could do it than there was going back to 2012.
Oh, yeah, and I think partly that's because we've had 2 kind of lean years. You know, if you look at 2022, at this point of the year, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion. Yeah. So in 2023, obviously, we know, absolutely, unassailable lead by this point. To give some faith to kind of play into that narrative, in new money, the 2007 season, so new points money, the 2007 season, Kimi Räikkönen, if you convert the points, that obviously it was 10 for a win at that point, he came from something like 50 or 60 points back to win the title, clutching, taking it from the clutches of Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso. So yes, Vettel is the biggest points in total, but if you convert 2007, it's not a million miles away. So I think that's partly what people are kind of, trying to hold on to there. But yeah, it's a lot of hype for something that is a very, very slim possibility.
And of course, the big thing with 78 points, if we look at a traditional format, so not including a sprint weekend, which of course there are still 3 more of those to come this season, 78 points, Max could theoretically miss 3 traditional race weekends, so that's 25 points for a race win plus the fastest lap point. It is a huge margin. And actually, when you look at Zandvoort this weekend, Max could win his home race for the 4th year in a row. Should he win and Lando finished second with the fastest lap points, then Max would lead going into the final 9 races of the year by 84 points. Okay, yes, that's only 6 more than 78, but that margin in itself then, hitting over that 80-point mark, feels like that's the point where actually it is just not possible, despite how many points there are still on the table.
Absolutely. This is a really big weekend that we're heading into for the championship. You're absolutely right. If he can extend that lead, take away the fact that Lando's lost 1 more opportunity out of the 10 to overturn that deficit, then yeah, it's looking almost impossible at that stage. So yeah, that's a very, very good point. And also, let's not forget that since F1 returned to Zandvoort, no one other than Max Verstappen has taken victory there. So it's a pretty tall order anyway for Lando heading into the weekend, regardless of any of the championship permutations.
And actually, the Dutch Grand Prix has thrown up some really interesting races. Obviously, last year, we all remember the wet to dry. It was just raining, then sunshine. It was all over the place. There was incidents everywhere. Max still came out on top. But actually, this weekend feels different because we know that Max is always strong there, regardless of Red Bull's current issues with the RB20. McLaren, we expect to be there. Mercedes, we expect to potentially be in the fight. And Ferrari, at the moment, you never quite know what they're going to do. There is no guarantee that actually Max is going to not only win this weekend, but actually finish on the podium, given how much competition there is now for the league places.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be a real ask for him. Mercedes have, even in 2022, they had one of their strongest races of the year here at Zandvoort. And McLaren will also be strong. It's a race that, although it's difficult to pass, has actually provided, as you say, some pretty entertaining races. Yeah. There is still the chance that we're going to have adverse weather conditions as well. I think it's pretty slim at the moment by the current forecasts for Sunday, but it's not out the realms of possibility. And as we know, forecasts change. So you could have that element thrown into the mix. And it's a fascinating strategy race. So it really could be quite an entertaining battle. And yeah, I think Ferrari as well, you mentioned, is an interesting one, because if you look back at kind of the Imola spec car, that was a car that was struggling in terms of outright power, but was still pretty good, around the streets of Monaco, for example. So if they can find a way to fix some of the recent bugbears they've had, ones that you kind of maybe took them out of the running in places like Budapest, if they can fix those, they could also be much closer. It's a short lap here as well as Zandvoort. So, expect the field to be a little bit tighter than usual in qualifying.
And just going back to Max finally before we move on, how do you expect him to return from the summer break? Because the first half of the season was kind of odd for him. He came out the blocks absolutely flying, won 4 of the first 5 races, the only exception being obviously his brake fire in the Australian Grand Prix, which obviously was nothing in his control. Ahead of the summer break, he went for a few rounds, obviously, of some difficulties. Silverstone came strong in the end, but didn't quite have enough for the win. Hungary, we all know what happened there. Of course, Austria, another one where obviously he clashed with Lando. And then the Belgian Grand Prix did really well to recover to 4th, having started P11th. P11 with his grid penalty. There is no doubting he's under a lot of pressure at the moment, despite the point advantage, given the struggles of Sergio Perez as well, because we'll talk about the constructors in a little while. But actually, Max has now had a few weeks to assess the situation, look back on the first half of the year. Do you think he's going to be feeling the pressure going into this weekend, or do you think he's actually just going to be like, you know what, if I win this weekend, there's a good chance that at least the drivers is then out of reach?
Yeah, I think he's going to basically come out swinging. That's what he knows. I don't know if you recall, but after Budapest, I said that I thought we'd see quite a conciliatory Max in media day, and he'd be quite kind of, yeah, okay, shouldn't have done that. And he was the opposite. I was completely wrong. He doubled down. He was like, no, look, this is me. The team, we're all good. The team's fine. They know that this is how things happen. It all comes out in the wash. So he's going to be like that. I also think he'll, in some ways, channel his kind of inner 2021. Yeah. It's a very different scenario. He has a huge advantage. He just needs to hold that steady. He just needs to maintain that over the next, it's a double header with Monza. If he can maintain that over the next 2 rounds, he's all good. He's sitting pretty. I think it's a very different scenario in some ways, because at the back end of 2021, he wilted under the pressure. Hamilton put together 3 or 4 race wins on the bounce to bring it to that finale in Abu Dhabi. It's a very, very tough order for Lando Norris to be able to do that. And Verstappen has far more experience now than he did then. He has experience of winning a championship. So I think whilst he will be more, or continue to be as aggressive as we've seen him on track, I think he knows that he just needs to kind of keep the status quo, keep the momentum kind of where it is at the moment, and he will be fine.
And that's actually a really interesting point, because looking back at 2021, something that Max, I think, can really learn from that is that in 2021, whenever there was an occasion where, for example, there was a clash or collision, he had some damage, he could quite easily, back in 21, have pitted and still have claimed a podium or a race win, because it was only Red Bull, Mercedes who were the dominant teams winning races. Now you look and you have McLaren in that mix, Mercedes in the mix, Red Bull in the mix, Ferrari at times in the mix. So actually, as we saw in Austria with that collision, Lando obviously ended up retiring from the race, and Max dropped from the lead down to P5, I believe it was, in the end. Nowadays, if Max was to have a collision or something, there's a good chance he would lose considerable points to potentially Norris. And actually, on the topic of Norris, a weird situation for him, I feel, because whilst he has, I guess, this dream with all the speculation, he could still win the driver's title. Alex Albon, interestingly, told us in an exclusive interview that he doesn't quite see the hype behind the driver's title and think it's more on the constructors, which I think is where we also agree on that. McLaren are only 42 points behind. That is very much where, as a team, McLaren's big chance is, not so much in the drivers. For Lando, do you think he's going to go into the second half of the season with the approach of, okay, the drivers is a bit far for me, but the constructors, that's really doable?
Yeah, I think, and I think he'll do well to have that aim. You and I know every time that you speak to a driver and say, so championship permutations, yeah, how do you think this factors in? Do you need to have a good weekend here for the the championship fight? You get the same response every time. I'm not thinking about the championship. It's too early in the season. It could be 2 rounds from the end. It's too early to think about that. I just need to keep on doing what I do every race. It won't change the way I approach it. I'll do what I do every time. Lando will do that, and he needs to do that. He needs to look at it in terms of, if I can look after the constructors, maybe, just maybe, the drivers' fight starts to come towards me. It's almost like pretending it's not there.
Yeah.
And, kind of, if you do, it becomes elusive. And Lando's in that difficult position where, yes, if you look at his head-to-head as we did the other day, 9-5 in terms of race results against Piastri, and I think it's 11-2 or something like that. 12-2 in qualifying head-to-heads to Piastri. There is this growing sense that Piastri has the upper hand. I mean, even in our recent poll, that we found that the majority of F1 fans actually think that Piastri is now, at the moment, the better driver out of the two. So it's this weird kind of situation for Lando to be in. He's got on the periphery this drivers' championship fight, but also he needs to kind of be looking at his own scenario and his own environment, going, "Am I still that guy for this team?" So there's a lot of things that needs to kind of play out over the remaining rounds, because Piastri's not so far back that he couldn't even pip Lando in the drivers' championship, which again would be a real turn up for the books.
And that last point there, that there's not a lot between them, is a really good point, because actually I've written it down. There's only 49 points between Lando in second and Sergio Perez in seventh. It's very, very tight behind Max. 49 points. Okay, yes, for Perez, it's very unlikely he's going to make a 49 points thing. Weirder things have happened. But actually, for Lando, if he does start finishing behind Oscar, there's a good chance that not only could Oscar jump him in the Drivers' Championship and potentially finish second, which obviously, whilst that's not what the money is, if Oscar was to finish ahead of Lando in the championship, that's a massive plus in his book. There's actually a chance that Lando could end up slipping down to fourth or fifth if he isn't finishing on the podium almost every single race, because we're seeing that's kind of the consistency drivers are needing this season to be high up in the standings. Look at Charles Leclerc. He's still third in the standings, despite actually, okay, he inherited a podium in Belgium, but actually a very mediocre first half of the season after winning in Monaco. There's still a lot that can change in the driver's standings behind Max.
Completely. And look at the momentum that Mercedes have going into the break.
Yeah, exactly.
3 wins and 4. And Russell's what? 7th in the constructors. And Lewis is in the drivers, rather, obviously. Russell's not a constructor. And Lewis, is there in the mix and will be able to take the fight to the likes of Charles and Lando over those final 10 races. So it is really delicately poised. So, and that's, where I think Lando needs to be very, very aware of. It's not just about looking ahead. He also needs to kind of be aware of the gaggle of drivers that he's currently in at the moment. And I mean, interestingly, Sergio Perez, he, points-wise, the last 2 years, he's finished the round in Zandvoort on 201 points. He is nowhere near that this year. And in fact, last year, it was after 13 rounds. This will be after 15. So that shows the drop-off that he's had. So that tells me that there is form for Sergio. Obviously, there's form for Sergio to find. So that 49-point gap between Sergio and Lando, it's not out of the realms of possibility. That shrinks a lot, and that's where the constructors fight becomes even more critical.
And it is the constructors where I guess more of the eyes are, because we've obviously got a double header. We've got Zandvoort this weekend, followed by the Italian Grand Prix. So the races are coming thick and fast. And there is a realistic chance that with McLaren only being 42 points behind, you never know, depending on what happens across the next 2 races. There is every chance McLaren could leave the Italian Grand Prix in Monza next weekend, actually ahead of Red Bull and leading the Constructors' Championship. With that in mind, it's a weird one for McLaren to play because of whilst Lando might still have the driver's title in his sights and obviously these aspirations and dreams, there's a realistic chance that not necessarily in the next 10 races, but actually in the next 2 or 3, McLaren could take the lead of a championship they've not led since I have absolutely no idea when. It's been a while. It's been a very long time.
Well, certainly it'll be, at the very least, the early 2010s. Obviously, It's not since 2008 that they've actually won the Constructors' title. So, yeah, a considerable amount of time.
And just on that point, though, we talk about in the past, obviously, McLaren having to use team orders and potentially a number 1, number 2 driver. Given the fact that they have got, when you look at the teams in the championship, it's McLaren who have got the team with the 2 highest performing drivers. 2 drivers who are performing quite equally to one another. Every week you can guarantee that one of them's going to be on the podium. I think McLaren have had 9 consecutive podiums in a row. It might even be 10, but it's been...
I think it's 10.
It's
yeah, maybe.
It's been an incredible run. Zach Brown said it a few weeks ago, and it's completely gone off my mind now. But they're being an exceptional run. You can guarantee that there's going to be a McLaren on the podium. Does that further illustrate why team orders or having a number 1, number 2 isn't the thing for McLaren to do? Because in the Constructors, where the money is, and we've said this several times, they have got their best chance of winning that championship in so many years.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on. I don't think team orders, in that sense, or a lead driver approach makes sense.
That's the way of putting it.
because obviously we've seen them enact team orders almost to kind of retain the status quo as opposed to change it, which is, kind of, there's, I guess, defensive and offensive team orders at play there, right? Between the 2. Why upset the apple cart now? What they're doing is clearly working. If you're going to start trying to prioritize Lando in the Drivers' Championship, you're just going to cause tension in the team with Oscar Piastri, who down the line, he's going to go, he's 70-something points back. Are we really doing this? Surely we know that the driver's title is, for all intents and purposes, done. It might get closer. It might not. It might get really close. But it's a really tall order, as we've discussed throughout this podcast already. So I think they'll want to keep things as they are. And it's, as I said, it's proving fruitful. Some races, Oscar's going to be there. Sometimes it's Lando. But they just need to keep on bringing that consistency. What they also will need to do is start getting both of them up there. I don't know if you've noticed, and if you look back over those last kind of 9 or 10 races, it's often one of them that gets it. Obviously, Hungary aside. But if they can start bringing, P2s and P3s, even if Verstappen is winning races, they're going to be in the right position, because then you're asking Sergio Perez to be right on the heels in P4 to kind of balance the point swing. So it's mathematically really fascinating, but they just need that consistency, that parity between the 2. And what they have at the moment, I think, is the best way of providing that.
And for McLaren, it would be a quite staggering situation to end the year 2nd and 3rd in the driver's standings, and then winning the Constructors will be quite phenomenal. And I need to apologise, so I've made a massive mistake. It's 49 points between 2nd and 6th, the losers in 6th. Sergio Perez is 7th, and it's absolutely not within 49 points of Lando Norris. Okay. So, but before people comment on that and realise, Nick, you've made a mistake, yes, I've just recognised that 2nd and 6th is 49 points. We've had the summer break, okay, I'm a bit rusty, but we're getting back into the swing of things. But actually,
let's notice myself.
Let's talk about Sergio Perez, because you mentioned there almost, with McLaren often having a driver with Max on the podium, and then the second one almost either just off the podium or at times on the podium as well. There's the big pressure on Checo now. He's been given the faith in Red Bull until the end of the year to stay with the team and try and get the results to prove that he really, I guess, deserves the 1+1 deal he was given earlier in the season. There's a lot of pressure on Checo, because with this doubleheader now, if he has a strong weekend in the Dutch Grand Prix, he suddenly has momentum for Monza, but a bad weekend will just further put him in this kind of downward spiral that he just can't seem to get out of. It feels like with the faith Red Bull have put in Checo, this is the weekend where he needs to show up, basically.
Absolutely. There's no better time to make a second first impression for him, if that makes sense. If he comes out of the summer break and makes a mistake, isn't where he needs to be, which is, broadly speaking, 3-4 tenths from Max over a lap, maybe a little bit less on a short circuit like Zandvoort. If he isn't there, you do remember that clip of at Silverstone when Christian Horner was kind of, after Perez had put it in the wall in qualifying, Christian Horner's kind of looking around, and if he wants to invoke that sort of reaction from Christian Horner, make a mistake is going to do that, and they'll be going, why did we do this? And the end of the year kind of deadline is interesting because that is obviously the end of his current deal, and as you say, the start of his 1+1 for 25 and 26. So it's almost like the performance clauses that we know about enable them to make that next contract completely void. Basically say, look, you haven't actually fulfilled what you need to get to that, which is then, as you say, why these 10 races are critical. If he has a bad weekend in Zandvoort, I'm not sure how he can mentally recover, because I think Gunther Steiner himself said he thinks it's mental. Doesn't seem to be car related specifically. Yes, the RB20 is much closer to its competitors and is proving more difficult. We've gone over this as to why in the past. The advantages that the Red Bull has are becoming increasingly reduced as the cars are developing through this regulation cycle. That is obviously becoming more difficult for him, and that margin of error isn't there. But at this point, he needs a strong weekend. I think if he can do that, find that, he can build from there. But it all hinges on this. He has to perform in Zandvoort.
And that's actually a very good point, because, okay, yes, Red Bull, we don't think have the strongest car anymore. It does look like it's McLaren, but nevertheless, Red Bull still have a very, very good car that can compete for victories, podiums. And I guess that's what separates the good drivers from the great drivers, and that a great driver can take a good car and win races as well as a very good car. Perez has proven that he can win in a very good car, but is yet to prove he can win in a good car, if that makes sense. And that's kind of his challenge, because it seems like ever since Red Bull haven't had the most dominant package, that's the point almost where he has started to falter. And I think we've seen him have these difficult periods in the past with Red Bull, but this season, again, it just feels different. His, I guess, difficult spell, however you want to put it, has gone on longer this year than in the past. And it does feel like almost he's got to find something in himself to and we know he's a talented driver. We remember his victory for Racing Point, his first ever F1 win. Racing Point, despite the fact, obviously, it was kind of dubbed as the pink Mercedes, it wasn't the best package in F1. It was not even necessarily, it was a good car. It was not necessarily a car that you expected to be fighting for regular podiums and victories, but it was a good car nevertheless. The car he has now is arguably better than that car he had back then. And this is what's really weird, in that, yes, okay, there are other teams with good and very good cars. You look at Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren. It feels like this is the point where Checo needs to show the driver he is, and actually he doesn't just need a very good car to win. He can win even when the car isn't performing at its best, as Max has done really throughout his career.
Exactly. And the fact that out of the top 8 drivers in the driver standings, which is the 2 drivers from the top 4 teams, Sergio is the only one without a race win this year. And He's also the only one who has a noticeable delta to his teammate. Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren, they are all pretty close driver pairings in terms of points, results, wins. Both Ferrari and McLaren, those guys have a win apiece across those 4 drivers. So it's that, I think, is the really damning aspect of it for Sergio. And just to kind of return to the stat I mentioned earlier about the kind of 201 points coming out of Zandvoort, and this feeds into your point about it feels different this year. Last year, he had a similar dip in the European season in the early summer, and he was still on 201 points after 13 rounds, second in the championship at that point, heading out of Zandvoort. He's on 131 at the moment, I think. So best case scenario, he leaves Zandvoort with 156? Still almost 50 points down on where he was last year. It's it's been really, really difficult for him, clearly. And I don't see how he brings it back from here. I think it's done. I think he will see out the season. And I think, he won't be able to retain his seat because of the principal reason that you've said that he can't win in a good car, and Red Bull face another year next year of having a good but not great car.
Exactly, and I guess another driver who obviously is leaving their current team at the end of the year is Lewis Hamilton. And let's discuss him, because obviously ended the first half of the season in incredible form, 2 wins from 3 races, now has his final 10 races of his Mercedes F1 career before obviously moving across to Ferrari. It feels a bit weird almost, because it's the most competitive Mercedes have been since 2021. And yet this is now the final countdown of his time with Mercedes, not just as a team, but actually with Mercedes as a company, the manufacturer that supported him since his karting days when he was a teenager.
Yeah, it's odd. I don't think any of us really thought that we would get to this point. Yeah. Obviously, once the contract was signed, we all were aware we'd get to this point. But the idea of Lewis leaving Mercedes, and especially as they are recovering and very much on the up, is a really odd thing to kind of sit with. And he'll want to go out on a high, obviously, naturally. And just it's how much momentum he can take into next year with Ferrari, and how much Mercedes themselves can take into next year. I think that will be the big key, the big thing. Everyone's building up for next year now. Yes, we have brilliant races on our hands here over the final 10 rounds. But aside from the constructors, like the Drivers' Championship is done. So the drivers, from that perspective, their focus will be on next year somewhat. Yes, obviously, there's still everything to play for in terms of the prize money. But I think for Lewis, we keep on coming back to this. Will he regret his decision? Is it, kind of... And as I said on a previous podcast, that the closer we get to Abu Dhabi, if the gap is still there between Mercedes and Ferrari, maybe he is kind of, going, or he's going to play into that narrative, and Ferrari and Lewis will start to get bored of that because we as media will keep on asking. But it's almost like he is sacrificing next year for 2026.
Yeah.
And that's what he kind of... It always looked like he obviously wanted to be part of that preparation, but now it's looking like an actual real kind of substantive sacrifice if that gap is still present in 25, which is a shame. So I think therefore that further adds to his want of going, you know what, this might actually be my last chance till 2026 to get a good number of race wins under my belt. So yeah, I fully expect to see him in the fight. And I think he'll easily, I think there's a very good chance that he ends the season with another 2 or 3 wins.
But of course, Ferrari are introducing across the second half of the season several big upgrades to try and get over the return of porpoising, which feels like a flash from the past almost. I guess it kind of is. But let's just stick with Mercedes finally with George Russell, because he entered the summer break, I guess, in a bit of a weird way, given that he won the Belgian Grand Prix pretty incredibly, to be honest, only to then be disqualified for his car being underweight. It's a weird one for him, because obviously having that win would have been such a high going into the summer, but then to then go into it with a disqualification would probably leave a bit of a sour taste in his mouth. How do you think he's going to approach the Dutch Grand Prix and the remainder of the season?
I think that he will... It's a bit cliche to talk about athletes in this way, or
I'm
just
not
anyone.
Surprised. I'm not used to speaking cliche. I'm not surprised.
But he will have a really short memory about this, about what happened in Belgium. I think he'll move on from it, and I think he will take the positives of going, you know what? Yes, Austria was fantastic, and I got the first race win in 18 months, or so he knows that wasn't on merit. He knows he inherited that win because of Verstappen and Norris's coming together. In Belgium, he knows that was a win on merit. Take away whatever advantages he might have had from having an underweight car, so on and so forth. The strategy call was a gutsy one, and it worked in terms of he didn't fall back through the order when the 2 stoppers, with the 2 stoppers being able to easily overtake him. It was a calculated risk, and it paid off. He will heed a lot of confidence from that. He will know that actually I can make calls like that on the fly. I can adapt. I can be, a little bit clever in the car. And pushed that car. We've unearthed a lot of development, a lot of gains in that W15. So I think he'll look at that much more than he'll look at the result of Belgium in the final outcome of being disqualified. So I think he'll really be coming in with him, in pretty good shape, pretty good mental place.
And that in itself, the fact that he can now push the car, try some different things, is almost a sign of how far Mercedes have come this season in quite a short period of time. Obviously, the team that's gone the other way is Ferrari due to their return to porpoising ever since they introduced a new floor for the Spanish Grand Prix, but it seems like potentially may be close to getting over the problem. We'll find out more, obviously, in Zandvoort. But Carlos Sainz, we spoke about Lewis, obviously, final 10 races with Mercedes before joining Ferrari. Carlos Sainz has been in this weird position the entire season. Knew before the first race that he wasn't going to be with Ferrari at the end of 2024. It was his last race. He's got 24 races to count down. He's had an exceptional year. Really, arguably, he's been consistent yet again. And of course, within 24 hours of the start of the summer break, it was confirmed that he will be joining Williams on a multi-year deal for next season after having interest from Alpine, Audi, Mercedes a little bit. It seemed like any team with a seat were interested in Carlos, which I guess is a sign of how good a job he's done. I guess he can feel potentially a bit hard done by, given that any Ferrari driver performing at Carlos's level will probably be retained. Unfortunately, it's not every day you get to sign Lewis Hamilton. Of course, Charles Leclerc is also Ferrari's golden boy a little bit. It's now the final 10 races of Carlos's time with Ferrari, and with his deal with Williams now done and dusted, you know what's happening in the next few years. It feels like he can now just go all guns blazing, show everyone what he can do, leave Maranello on a high, give the Tifosi something to celebrate. Is this the point now where we're going to see Carlos just absolutely gun it?
I think so. Now that he's set aside the insecurity of having to figure out his future, and I say insecurity, I mean, he had offers on the table. He knew that he would be in F1. It was just the difficult choice of making the choice.
Which one? Yeah.
And that, as he said himself, has weighed on him. And looking back at our driver ratings for the mid-season, I factored that into why I thought Carlos has had a really productive and really impressive first 14 rounds. Was he did all of that whilst he had everything about his future going on in the background and kind of bubbling beneath the surface. So now that is cleared, I think you're going to see a driver who essentially is well aware that this is probably his last opportunity for a year or two, at least, at the very least, of fighting for regular, let's say, podiums, because I think it all remains to be seen how Ferrari can recover with those upgrades. But he will go out and go, you know what, this is my last opportunity to really kind of show what I can do and enjoy myself in that sense without any pressure. Williams clearly love him. James Vowles clearly loves him. He doesn't have to worry about any of that. He can just focus on how can I perform week in, week out. And so, I think much like Lewis, you'll see a driver trying to have that last hurrah.
And the weird thing with Carlos is that obviously he's kind of accepted for next season a move from a leading team to the midfield. A driver who's currently in the midfield, who ahead of the year was looking at a seat in a top team and is now just trying to save their F1 career, is Daniel Ricciardo. We spoke about Sergio Perez earlier and Red Bull giving the faith in him until the end of the season. The same has happened with Daniel. He's effectively been given the final 10 races of the year to effectively save his F1 career and I suppose prove that he could still be the one to replace Sergio Perez at Red Bull if they decide to part ways with Sergio. It's a big 10 races for Daniel, starting, of course, with the Dutch Grand Prix, where you go back last season and it's where his injury, his broken hand, happened.
Yeah, it's this weird situation where he almost is just as likely to find himself in a Red Bull next year as he is to find himself in the sidelines. And seemingly the position that I don't think any of us really think he'll be in, which probably is the most likely, is that he will be alongside Yuki Tsunoda at RB next year.
Yeah.
It's we almost that kind of do nothing option, that third way, we're not even really considering. So it's in his hands. I think more so than it's in Perez's hands. Because if Daniel performs really, really well, and Helmut Marko has been quite clear that Daniel hasn't done enough in the first 14 rounds to warrant that Red Bull drive. But if he can show his hand, it might just be enough to get Red Bull to go, okay, we'll make that switch. We'll bring Liam into the team. And we're expecting an announcement on Liam in September. If that is that Liam is being brought into the RB team, then surely it then becomes that kind of binary, either you're at Red Bull or you're not. It's, again, there's a lot of tension within the team, the joint teams of RB and Red Bull, which I think plays into the situation. Helmut Marko has been very clear that he feels that RB needs to transition back to being almost a junior outfit.
Yeah.
A training ground for Red Bull drivers. The whole RB rebrand was to move away from that. And Daniel Ricciardo has himself said that to Ian, that he wouldn't be comfortable with that idea. And so that's difficult for him to kind of potentially have to acquiesce with. But then also Laurent Mekies has also then said to Ian, because we have a number of exclusive interviews over the summer, so do check out those on the website. There isn't just one person who makes the decision. It's a whole group, including shareholders. So who knows which way it's going to go? We obviously were completely wrong about the Perez situation. So it is a really, really critical 10 rounds for Daniel Ricciardo. How it plays out, I wouldn't want to make a guess at this stage. I don't know if you would, because honestly, who knows? It's such a volatile driver market at the moment. But I think he is heading in the right direction. I think he'll feel like he's got the momentum. He certainly was a much better match for Yuki over the final few rounds heading into the summer break. So yeah, I don't think the whole Zandvoort incident from last year will play on his mind.
No.
But I think, it will be a case of, I've got 10 races. What can I do with them?
You do get a feeling, at least I get the feeling, that it kind of feels like there's going to be at least one experienced driver from the Red Bull family not on the grid next season. Of course, as you mentioned, the Liam Lawson announcement in September, whatever that's going to be, is going to just further add drama to the storyline. Sam, it's that time of the podcast where we have to do our bold predictions for the Dutch Grand Prix. I'll give you a second to think, because I'm going to go first. I think it is quite bold. I think Max is going to win. He's just, the support he gets from the Dutch fans is just incredible. And I just think he's going to come out the blocks after the summer, blow everyone away, and then leave with an 80-plus point lead in the championship. And I think a hand and a half on the title. But my bold prediction is I think Sergio Perez is going to finish on the podium. Just got a feeling he's going to get a podium. You?
I was going to go with something similar in terms of I think Perez is going to show, have a good weekend. Realistically, I can't escape a Max win either. I think bold prediction. I'm going to go a little bit off piece and go with a driver that we haven't spoken about at all, and also kind of why would we? But Pierre Gasly has always performed pretty well.
Yeah, it's definitely different.
Oh yeah, no, completely. So I think Pierre Gasly is going to have a really strong weekend. So that's my bold prediction. I think he'll be, not top 5, but I think he'll potentially be 6th or 7th. He could have a really strong time in Zandvoort. But if we're looking at the top of the order, I think my bold prediction will be a Ferrari podium.
Bold. That was several bold podcasts, so I'll give you that. And a voice break from me just to add to it. Obviously, for those who are watching on YouTube, be sure to let us know your bold predictions in the comment section below, and also share your thoughts on any of the talking points from this week's podcast. From Sam and myself, we'll see you this weekend for the Dutch Grand Prix. See you later.
Thanks for joining us.